Elden Ring is a game which at this point requires no introduction. But despite being From Software's most commercially successful and popular game to date, I can't find it in myself to hold the game in such high regard. In fact, the more I play of Elden Ring, the more concrete my disappointment in it becomes. To reemphasize that, it really is a feeling of disappointment, not dislike. This video wouldn't exist if I simply thought that Elden Ring was a bad game. With that said, I'll be going through all of the issues I have with the game, many of which work directly against the things that Elden Ring does exceptionally well. Of course, to make a claim like that, I would first have to establish what it is that Elden Ring excels at. Thankfully, that doesn't prove to be much of a challenge. Anyone who has played the game can easily recall certain times that remain in the mind long after they've stopped playing, moments that stand out in their sheer memorability. Whether it takes the form of the first descent into Seofor River, the now iconic opening view of Liurnia, finding a hidden path to an item, or trying to puzzle out pieces of the game's lore, it is in these unique experiences that Elden Ring is at its strongest. Through its focus on exploration, Elden Ring allows the player's discoveries to feel more natural, which in turn imparts a sense of grand adventure. What I find so disappointing, then, are the myriad design choices which make these experiences less frequent and harder to enjoy, often putting convenience and convention ahead of innovation, to the detriment of the game as a whole. That was pretty vague, so let's look at an example. In this case, the game's map system and how it stifles exploration. When the game starts, players can only navigate through active engagement with the game world. To find their way to any given destination, the player must first be able to see it from their character's current location, then formulate a plan of how to get there by observing the surrounding landscape, and finally carry out that plan by physically exploring the game's world. As soon as the map is found, however, this all goes out the window. Now the player can consult the map at almost any time to find the optimal route to any location, and then speed there on horseback. For how huge of a game Elden Ring is, it's remarkable that I never found myself getting lost in it. Giving the player a map like this is practically begging them to look away from the world itself, even more of a shame when it looks as good as this one. Such a method of exploration is far too mundane for a world as fantastic as the lands between. In fact, I would hesitate to call it exploration at all, since both the destination and the path to get there are fully known before setting out. If the player chooses to incorporate the beacons, which already look terribly out of place, the experience is practically the same as in so many other open world games. Just follow the ever-present compass to the next waypoint. I've heard people compliment Elden Ring's map for not overwhelming the player with icons and markers for each important location, like Ubisoft open world games do. Firstly, this isn't exactly high praise. Secondly, and more importantly, this isn't even true. The vast majority of important locations are very clearly visible on the map even before the player visits them. Tunnels, ruins, everjails, rises, churches, and minor Erdtrees all have distinct marks to indicate their presence on the map. Catacombs also have statues which point towards them, which in turn show up on the map. This leaves only caves and a small number of miscellaneous locations as being naturally discoverable. Everything else, the map has already told you where it is. Sure, there aren't tooltips telling you the recommended level range or rewards for clearing each of these locations, but it's already most of the way there, when a more minimalist approach would have been appropriate for a game which leans so heavily on mystery and discovery. Seeing a distant landmark and finding your way to it is simply more rewarding than following a map. If the goal was to prevent players from getting lost, I can only see that as misguided. Ending up in an entirely unexpected and unknown location is often enjoyable in itself. If it were only up to me, the map would have been removed entirely, but there are compromises which could have been made to keep the game's exploration intact without alienating wider audiences. By simply not showing the player their current location, and of course removing beacons, the act of reading the map itself can become engaging once again, as shown by Kingdom Come Deliverance and Hollow Knight. The opposite approach was taken by Breath of the Wild, where the map only showed topographic detail, so the player couldn't rely on it exclusively. Elden Ring's map gives players too much information too accurately and precisely, and suffers for doing so. If the map fragments were at least hard to find, I would be much more likely to forgive this decision, but their extreme ease of discovery is a bit condescending on its own. Given that players will spend so much time traveling through the lands between, it's unfortunate that traversal itself, like navigation, has been made trivial, this time through Torrent. The Spectral Steed is an extremely powerful tool, faster and more agile than almost all enemies. This means that by far the most effective strategy for picking up items is to just run by on Torrent while ignoring enemies. Running past enemies has always been a possibility in the Souls games, but in Elden Ring, the open layout of camps combined with Torrent's speed makes enemies into a complete joke, more so than ever. Many encounters in the open world which could have been memorable challenges for the player to overcome now may as well not exist. Of course, the player can still choose to go on foot, but to do so highlights another issue with making Torrent so useful, that a real person in the character's situation would always use Torrent to avoid enemies. It's both faster and safer to do so. To intentionally forego Torrent would be an absolutely stupid thing to do from the point of view of a real adventurer. At the same time, the player using Torrent to skip enemies only serves to make the game less engaging and interesting. By making Torrent too strong of a tool for certain situations, the player's interests begin to diverge from the character they're playing as. The character only cares about getting the shiny item while staying alive, but the player would also like to have some fun while doing so. Many games fall into the trap of making traversal an afterthought, so it's hard to be too harsh on Elden Ring for this, especially considering that it is From Software's first attempt at making an open world game, where issues with traversal are more apparent. Still, other aspects of Torrent's implementation also leave a lot to be desired. Most obviously, mounted combat is lackluster at best, with the player only being able to wield one weapon at a time and completely lacking the ability to block, dodge, or use Ashes of War. Using Torrent to close the distance in dragon fights does almost justify his inclusion by itself, but otherwise there are very few times where he feels properly integrated into the rest of the game. Narratively, Torrent is presented as a true companion by both Melina and Ronnie, with at least some personality of his own. But mechanically, Torrent is only a tool for getting around faster. By the end of the game, there's very little in the way of a meaningful bond between the player and Torrent. I've spent a lot of time riding around on Torrent, but the strongest emotion I feel towards him is annoyance when he gets staggered too easily or gets one-shot by in-game enemies. Just providing some way of upgrading Torrent's health and poise would be an effective, if shallow, way of both alleviating those annoyances and creating player attachment to Torrent through a sense of investment. Torrent also suffers from the sense that his very presence is entirely artificial. Torrent can't be ridden indoors or underground, except when he can be ridden indoors and underground. This lack of consistency is made all the worse by the blue borders that appear on the ground to indicate the limits of where Torrent can or can't be ridden. These limits are so clearly arbitrary that any sense of Torrent being an actual creature in the game's world is completely destroyed. It would be far better to simply give the player full discretion of when to summon Torrent. Many areas are too cramped for him to be useful, but I would hope that players can be trusted to figure that out on their own. This would have also prevented the strange decision to not allow his use in the Elden Beast fight. Even if Torrent turned out to not be very useful against Elden Beast, not allowing the player to summon him at all feels like an insult to his very existence. The player's other companion, Melina, feels similarly underutilized. After her introduction, she only appears a handful of times, and often just to quote Marika. Despite ostensibly traveling with the player for the vast majority of the game, she feels completely absent, since interactions with her are so rare. This could have been easily solved by just having her appear every time the player levels up, or even better, every time the player rests at a site of grace. As it is, Melena's death or betrayal feel much more hollow than they should. That the event also has no mechanical consequences is something that I take particular issue with. Since the player only gains the ability to level up after being joined by Melina, it's clear that she is vital for that task. When she temporarily leaves upon reaching Landel, she states that she's leaving the power to level up with the player, which indicates that she could take it away. Yet, when she swears to hunt down and kill you, she still graciously allows you to level up, because inconveniencing the player at all just isn't something Elden Ring is willing to do, even when it's the right choice. The Souls games stood out in large part because their mechanics reinforced the game's narrative and thematic elements. Some of these mechanics could be considered harsh or obscure, but they each fit perfectly with the ideas each game was trying to convey. Elden Ring seems scared to use its mechanics to the same effect, even when the opportunity so clearly presents itself. Earlier, I said that Torrent feels artificial. This is very true, but what's even worse is that Elden Ring's artificiality can be felt in nearly every facet of the game. Of course, I know that this is a video game set in a fictional world, but a good work of fiction allows the audience to suspend their disbelief by crafting an internally consistent and therefore believable world. This is something that the Souls games are known for doing exceptionally well, with great attention to detail playing a large role in that. Elden Ring has a much larger world in terms of what the player can physically traverse, but manages to feel much less cohesive in comparison. One of the culprits here is the repetitive nature of Elden Ring's side areas. The biggest offenders are the game's various catacombs, which all share the same architecture, enemies, and music, despite being built all over the world. Look a little closer, and you might realize that they aren't really catacombs. Sure, they do look like catacombs, and some even have the stereotypical skeleton to fight, but they clearly aren't usable as catacombs. For example, is there any in-world explanation as to why the Ariza side tomb is filled with transporter traps, or is this just another area created to pad out the open world because otherwise people would complain that it's too empty? Obviously, it's the latter, and this sense of unbelonging is present in nearly every side dungeon to some extent. To be clear, I have no problem with this little puzzle on its own, but it comes off as being out of place. The mini dungeons feel incredibly fake and do a terrible job of selling the lands between as a world with any actual history behind it. Compare this to the highly realistic levels in Demon Souls or even Elden Ring's own legacy dungeons, which happen to be some of the most complex in the series due to their verticality, and the difference in quality is astounding. That myself and so many others are choosing to skip these areas whenever possible on repeat playthroughs should say enough about whether they are a worthwhile inclusion. Players that are going through the game for the first time don't even have the luxury of allowing themselves to pass these low quality areas by because many important items are located in them. For any given build, the vast majority of extrinsic rewards in these areas won't be very helpful, but a small number will hold extremely useful items. Without prior knowledge, it's impossible for the player to know which locations have which items, so they get trapped in a certain fear of missing out, where they might not be getting much out of the actual experience of completing all these locations, but feel compelled to do so anyways, because they don't want to miss a powerful talisman or an interesting weapon. In Legacy Dungeons, picking up an item you won't use doesn't evoke nearly the same negative reaction, because the levels are complex enough that just finding your way to the item is an interesting experience in itself. To be clear, I don't think that letting the player see the items in a location beforehand is a viable solution. This would just ruin any sense of mystery even more. Rather, if these areas are only there to contain the item at the end, then they are just filler and shouldn't be in the game at all. Another feature of these side dungeons that becomes downright baffling when examined closely is the teleporter at the end of each one, which transports the player back to the start. Not only are these utterly unexplainable, further contributing to the artificial feeling of these areas, but they aren't even well implemented. While the player is clearing a mini dungeon, fast travel is disabled once again without any in-game reason, only to be nonsensically re-enabled after the dungeon boss is defeated. When the player uses fast travel, it has the same effect as resting at a site of grace, healing the player and reviving enemies. Using the teleporter, however, only revives enemies without giving the player the benefits of resting. At this point, the player has just fought a boss and may have used up many of their resources, so the idea of continuing without resting is unappealing. At the same time, the site of grace is located farther from the entrance than where the teleporter puts you, so the player has to waste time first fast traveling and then running outside. These teleporters shouldn't be in the game at all. They're a lazy solution to a non-existent problem, but if they're going to exist, they should at least be useful. Since I've brought up repetition, that means it's time to talk about Elden Ring's boss fights. But to even begin talking about this, we first have to answer a question. What is a boss fight? Elden Ring would lie to your face and say that anything with a boss health bar is a boss, but there's just something indescribably wrong with putting Melania in the same category as this. Elden Ring's attempt to pass off generic enemies as bosses not only presents some pacing and balancing issues, but also lessens the idea of what a boss encounter is. In some sense, this is only an issue of player perception. An enemy having a boss health bar doesn't really change the enemy itself, but this excuse is deceptive. After all, the player's entire experience relies on how they perceive the game, so problems with presentation can be just as, if not more important than anything else. Although I do think it was a bad idea to present generic enemies as bosses, it's at least understandable that they would be reused. That is to say, it makes sense that there would be multiple of them. What isn't at all justifiable is the blatant reuse of some of the game's most important and iconic bosses. Finding copies of Godric or Astel is more obviously bad in that it diminishes the impact of those bosses and their initial appearances. But even worse, it has a knock-on effect for every other major boss. If a creature as mysterious and unique as Astel can be duplicated without explanation, what's to say that Elden Beast can't be reduced to guarding smithing stones as well? Reusing major bosses and characters in this way imparts a sense of cheapness, not just for the repeat encounters, but to the entire game, undermining any chance at cultivating an atmospheric experience. Even some duplicate fights that could have plausible explanations suffer from continuity errors. Margit's first appearance in Stormvale won't occur if Morgott has already been defeated, but Margit's second appearance in Lindell will still happen even after Morgott is dead. Just as bad is that Mohg's clone still guards the sewers even after both the real Mohg and Morgott are defeated. At first, I thought this must be a bug, but seeing as it hasn't been changed so long after the game's release, this somehow seems intentional. Even aside from these issues, the actual gameplay is only sometimes good. Of the initial four Great Room bosses, three have mechanics which help to differentiate them. Radahn in particular stands out as being memorable to the same degree that Maiden Estrella or Micolash were, and both Renala and Rykard are the best incarnation of their respective gimmicks, with great presentation on top of that. Sadly, it's all downhill from here. Every traditional boss fight in Elden Ring has some combination of a few issues, which include attacks with ridiculously long wind-up animations, extended attack strings with no opportunity for counterplay, and highly evasive actions which keep the player out of melee range. Combined, this takes the form of a 10-hit combo with some attacks having arbitrarily long wind-ups, followed by a backflip that covers half the arena to prevent the player from punishing. This behavior is so ubiquitous that I don't even need to show examples. Anyone who has played the game can remember this happening all the time. The high amount of starting stamina given to the player since Bloodborne might account for why enemy attack strings are so long now. If the player can dodge more attacks without running out of stamina, the easiest way to maintain the challenge is to simply add more attacks for the player to dodge. But it should be clear that this doesn't lead to more engaging or complex combat. If anything, it makes combat less complex because what little depth the combat system does have is in its offensive options. For defense, rolling is the default. At this point, the ardent defenders of the series can have their turn to point out that blocking and parrying exist. While this is technically true, those options tend to be secondary and situational at best. This is because the designers can never be sure that the player will have access to anything besides rolling. The ability to block and parry is tied to equipment, while rolling is innate to every character. So, as enemies attack more, players roll more, and Elden Ring devolves into a monotonous slog of samey fights, with the only differentiating factor being just how annoying they are. Elden Ring's combat system simply lacks the depth necessary for fights to be anything besides this when pushed to the extreme, and as a result, From Software's decision to put so much focus on the action seems misguided. I can't see this situation improving without either a full overhaul of the combat system or a shift back to the more unique experiential boss encounters. Of those two options, I would prefer the latter. If Elden Ring's combat had the depth and complexity of a dedicated action game, it would be tempting to call that an improvement, but that would only be true in a vacuum. The Souls games benefit from their relatively slow but highly committal gameplay because it allows players to spend more time observing the game, both its world and enemies. With how many little details these games have, encouraging patient play seems like the right choice. Implementing a deeper combat system would likely be a waste of time regardless, because the game's RPG elements disincentivize mastering combat anyways. The high damage of in-game enemies has been a commonly criticized part of the game, but the big numbers aren't the root of the problem. They just make the issue of bad encounter design more noticeable. To me, turning down these numbers isn't an acceptable solution. Melania's waterfowl dance would still be a poorly designed attack even if it did 0 damage. Fire Giant would still be a bad fight with a terrible camera even if he had less health. And the ulcerated tree spirit is so awful that it shouldn't be in the game once, let alone over a dozen times. Some bosses even have attacks which do unpreventable damage, just to make sure you understand that the mantra of hard but fair isn't applicable. It's impossible for me to say why these bosses ended up the way they did. If I allow myself to speculate, it does seem like there's some sort of one-upmanship at play when it comes to boss difficulty in successive From Software games. If I'm right, this may have been partially driven by the player base's own apparent obsession with boss fights. Ultimately, it is the developer's responsibility to decide when enough is enough, but that line can be hard to find when some of their most vocal fans herald these games' difficulty more than Bandai Namco's marketing team. Regardless of the reason why, another thing to note is that the bosses in Elden Ring are segmented off from the areas they're associated with. There's almost always a checkpoint right before the boss arena. This means that players will always go in as prepared as possible. In turn, the bosses can be made more difficult, and these fights serve as a standalone challenge. I doubt that Elden Ring's bosses would have fallen into their current messy state if the player had to fight their way back to the boss each time instead. Interestingly, this is how the earlier Souls games tended to operate, with bosses serving as a capstone at the end of an area. By just being the last in a series of encounters, there wasn't the same pressure to make the bosses themselves overly difficult. Since Elden Ring's combat system continues to function very well while going through its legacy dungeons, putting more resources into that part of the game might have been the right call anyways. Put another way, I would rather spend time exploring From Software's levels than fighting their bosses. The field bosses, which are encountered in the open world, present a whole new set of concerns. The other bosses in Elden Ring all exist in walled-off areas with tightly defined boundaries. Ideally, this would allow for the arena to be just as much a part of the encounter as the boss itself, although Elden Ring typically fails to do anything of the sort. But this also allows the developers to more thoroughly test encounters and prevent bosses from interacting strangely with the terrain, which is why large bosses in the Souls games are almost always fought in very flat arenas. In my first playthrough of Elden Ring, I fought a Gil very early on. His introduction and subsequent fight were very memorable. I didn't have Torrent yet, but I was able to use the nearby rocks to block his breath attacks. This experience left me very impressed and hopeful that From Software had managed to integrate large bosses into an even larger world. Going back through the game again, I learned just how lucky I was to get such a smooth fight. It seems like half the time he just gets stuck in a cliff, and even when he doesn't, the close by ruins can also cause him to move very awkwardly. Many large enemies in Elden Ring have similar issues, clipping into the ground or tilting to make access to critical attack targets impossible, sometimes even on flat terrain. Of course, all that seems like it's barely an issue at all compared to when field bosses simply phase out of existence when they get leashed. Keep in mind, many field bosses are very agile, mounted or flying enemies, but the game isn't able to handle them moving more than a few hundred feet from their starting location. If enemies are only going to function properly within a predefined area anyways, then there's no point to making the game open world in the first place. Enemies in the Souls games have always been leashable, but Elden Ring should have taken the opportunity to properly solve the issue instead of using such an absurd-looking half measure that breaks any sense of immersion. Considering how many issues are connected in some way to Elden Ring's open world, I have to question whether or not it was a good idea to design the game in this way at all. Of course, from a financial perspective, it is unlikely that Elden Ring would have sold so well without conforming to such a popular and mainstream format, but this speaks little to the game's actual quality. Open world games are often praised for giving the player the freedom to explore almost every corner of the map, but there is a key drawback that comes with giving such an unconstrained view of the world. Clearly, I'm implying that Elden Ring does something wrong here, but to demonstrate exactly how its open world format is so destructive to its world building, we need to go back, in this case, to Demon Souls. In that game's first world, Boletaria, the player can only explore a single castle, which is in total roughly the size of one of Elden Ring's legacy dungeons. At the same time, Boletaria is shown in the game's introduction to be a large and significant kingdom. This presents a potential inconsistency, where the player is meant to understand Boletaria as an entire kingdom, but has a hard time thinking of it that way because they only get to traverse a tiny fraction of it. The solution is extremely simple. By just including a city in the distance, which is also mentioned by an NPC, and making the skybox into a sprawling landscape, everything is in place for the player to perceive the world as the developers intended. Inconsistency avoided. Similar techniques are used in practically every non-open world game. Even though we all know logically that these are only low detail props that wouldn't hold up if we got close to them, it's enough for the brain to conceive of it as if it were real. Just like well done visual effects in film. The important bit is that the majority of the work here happens in the player's imagination. We can imagine how that city would be if the game would only let us go there. This is the promise that open world games try to fulfill, but reality can rarely match imagination. Returning to Elden Ring, hopefully it's clear how it can't use the same method to flesh out its world. Since the player can set foot on every extent of the lands between, the game itself has to do all the work. It can't rely on imagination to pick up the slack. In theory, and with infinite time and money, handcrafting every aspect of an entire fictional universe might be the perfect approach to game development. But with more practical budgets and deadlines, it usually leaves a lot to be desired. In Elden Ring, this takes the form of multiple kingdoms and factions apparently all living in a few burnt-out ruins, which all use the same generic assets with no regional distinctions between them. It simply doesn't paint a very convincing picture that the lands between were ever inhabited by an actual civilization with its own culture, let alone several conflicting ones. Elden Ring is already a huge game, and I'm not suggesting it would have benefited from being even bigger. If anything, this would have only aggravated the tedium of repeated locations and enemies. Instead, I would suggest that by having to conform to an open world layout, Elden Ring made things much more difficult for itself without gaining much in return. In fact, many of the supposed benefits of open world design were already achieved in previous From Software titles. Demon Souls and Dark Souls both had non-linear world design and better balance of those worlds. All the Souls games have iconic and beautiful vistas like the ones in Elden Ring, and even Bloodborne's Chalice dungeons provided a more replayable and varied experience than Elden Ring's own side areas without getting in the way of the rest of the game. At the same time, Elden Ring being open world means that the amount of work required to present a coherent world is astronomically higher than in the previous games, so it should be no surprise when it fails to reach the same mark. To be clear, I'm not saying that no games benefit from large and open spaces to explore. The criminal sandboxes of the Grand Theft Auto series would be far less enjoyable without room to breathe, and the novel traversal mechanics of Death Stranding only make sense when the player is able to choose their own route. But Elden Ring haphazardly combines traditional Souls gameplay and level design with open world tropes like fast travel, a too convenient map and mount, and repetitive low quality areas for a result that undeniably has mass appeal, but fails to combine these unfocused ideas into something greater than the sum of its parts. Even when it tries to do something different, Elden Ring often falls short. Ashes of War seem like a good idea, and are a natural extension of Dark Souls 3's weapon arts, but poor balancing means that a few of them are far better than the rest, leading to less variety, not more. Including a posture system similar to Sekiro's could have added much needed depth to combat, but the decision to not display posture damage and inconsistent mechanics for stance breaks prevents it from having much impact. Guard counters also suffer indirectly from posture's poor implementation, and some weapon classes have guard counters which just tend to miss anyways. Even jumping is underutilized, despite Sekiro showing the potential of having multiple defensive options. There are a few attacks that can only be jumped, not rolled, but this separation seems arbitrary and nonsensical. The day and night cycle could have allowed for more dynamic world states, like an improved version of World Tendency. But instead, it just means that if you want to fight a night-only boss, you have to rest again and use another menu. Crafting is irrelevant at best and quickly veers into tedium. The loading screens spoil a couple of the game's better moments, and the ambient music often clashes with its diegetic counterparts. Stakes of America are a good acknowledgement that if the player can run back to a boss without being in danger, then the run back is just an arbitrary waste of time. Yet the game fails to use them for some of the game's longest runs, instead opting to scatter stakes throughout the overworld, making it even less threatening. The equipable Great Runes almost all have boring and equivalent effects, with the only interesting one being so late in the game as to be rendered worthless. But the award for the worst new feature can go to none other than Spirit Ashes. In short, Spirit Ashes are overpowered, with the best spirits being better than most other players. Further, summoning spirits doesn't open you up for invasion or increase boss health pools. Even the relative cost of using spirits goes down over time as players acquire more flask charges. The typical counter-argument here is that if I feel Spirit Ashes make the game too easy, I just shouldn't use them. After all, if any mechanic that makes the game easier is bad, then we would also have to throw out leveling, weapon upgrades, any form of healing, and so on. In general, I do agree with this line of thinking. Elden Ring, like the Souls games before it, does a pretty good job of integrating difficulty selection into the game. Going into a menu and flipping a switch to change the difficulty level is just about as immersion breaking as it gets, so this is something I really appreciate. That being said, Spirit Ashes are so powerful that I don't think this argument applies anymore. If summoning the strongest spirit can carry players through every boss in the game without ever facing a challenge, then things have gone too far. The point of difficulty in these games is to give players a sense of accomplishment by overcoming adversity, so giving players a tool which lets them all but bypass that difficulty will necessarily reduce the sense of accomplishment as well. Additionally, the extreme strength of some summons calls into question how powerful certain entities in the game are. When Melania can be soloed by Black Knife Tish or the Mimic tier, it just makes the idea of her having never known defeat seem a bit silly. Since Spirit Ashes are so strong, it might be reasonable to instead see them as a core part of gameplay, a mechanic that all players are intended to use, like weapons or rolling. After seeing all the poorly balanced duo fights in my first playthrough where I didn't summon, I was under this impression as well. So, on my second playthrough, I started summoning and discovered a whole other set of issues. Encounters are undoubtedly easier with summons, but they also become much buggier, to the point that I can't accept the idea that using summons is the intended way to play. Bosses have behaved strangely when fighting multiple players since Demon Souls, but these issues are much worse when combat is faster and enemy attacks have excessive tracking. It's also more understandable in a low-budget experimental title than it is for a game with the budget and development time of Elden Ring to have the same bugs and lack of AI after 13 years with multiple games in between where they also could have been fixed. This puts Elden Ring's boss fights in a lose-lose situation. Either players don't summon, and they have to put up with many insultingly poorly designed encounters, or they do summon, and they have to put up with things like this, and this. Even if these bugs and balance issues weren't present, I couldn't say that using Spirit Ashes makes the combat better. Since their main benefit is splitting up enemy attention, using them simply means that players have to engage less with the game's mechanics. Perhaps this is an implicit admission that Elden Ring's combat design just isn't very good, but if that's the case, the solution should be to improve the combat, not to let players disengage with it altogether. As a final insult, the icon that indicates when the player can summon spirits can't be disabled, and often spoils the appearance of surprise encounters. I'm going to make a bold claim now. Elden Ring doesn't respect its players. If you don't believe me, watch what happens when I murder Kale in cold blood. He drops two things, both of which are critical to my argument. The first is the finger snap gesture. Kale should only teach me this after I ask about howling in the Mistwood, but since Elden Ring won't let me suffer the consequences of my actions, I just get the gesture by killing him instead. I can then begin Blythe's quest line, and he still believes that Kale sent me.
Carly sent you, did he?
Kale also dropped his bell bearing, a feature shared by all NPCs that sell items. Not only does this encourage players to kill every merchant they come across, it also destroys any sense of groundedness when it comes to NPC quest lines. When Dee dies in Round Table Hold, it should probably upset the player, at least a little. Here's a guy that's been totally helpful, and the player gets tricked by Fia into assisting her in murdering him. But as it turns out, this is only a good thing for the player mechanically. His bell bearing means that we still have access to the spells he was selling, and we also get his armor, as well as progressing some other quests. To see how this can be done well, we can once again look to earlier entries in the same series. In both Demon Souls and Dark Souls, NPCs will often move and act on their own, sometimes dying or going hollow, and sometimes even killing each other. When this happens, there's no recourse for the player, and as a result, their death feels so much more real. Elden Ring seems afraid to do anything that would seriously impede the player in a similar way. Just as bad are the inexplicable golden barriers which prevent the player from harming certain NPCs. I hope I don't need to explain how insulting this sort of coddling design is, but even if I accepted it as a way to prevent stupid players from locking themselves out of certain quests, which I don't, it raises another issue. Since these barriers are totally unbreachable, it leads to a situation where my character can kill what the game describes as a literal god, yet doesn't stand a chance against this naked guy passed out in a sewer. Far more noticeable than the golden barriers are certain areas where attacking isn't allowed at all. This was introduced in Sekiro, but it wasn't an issue there because Sekiro is a predefined protagonist who clearly wouldn't attack certain people. In Elden Ring, this isn't the case at all, and the areas that block attacking once again feel completely arbitrary. The Round Table Hold, at least, has some sort of peace agreement, although the idea that the Dung Eater would be more honorable than Fia seems questionable, but the other peaceful zones have no justification at all. The one in Stormvale Castle is clearly just to protect Roger, making him a character that always dies yet is never killable by the player. The one in Volcano Manor is particularly egregious, since anyone playing as a more righteous character would really just go on with the intention of killing them all. Instead, the only way to progress is to side with them, and attacking isn't even allowed. Players who complete the assassination requests for Volcano Manor might notice something else disturbing. No one else cares. That the player can go around killing other Tarnished and not get any reactivity from other NPCs should raise some red flags, but this issue goes even deeper. No one cares if the player is a recusant with the Volcano Manor. No one comments when Fia murders Dee, kills some merchants, and the rest are still happy to do business with you, despite what Kale's dialogue may indicate. In general, the world and the characters in it simply don't react to the player's actions or anything else. Goldmask and Fia should be diametrically opposed to each other, yet the player can obtain both of their mending runes without any issue. And even if I start helping the Dung Eater, no one seems to think that I might not be the right choice for the next Elden Lord. Ronnie doesn't care or even acknowledge the player beating Renala, despite her intervening in the fight itself. The more you look, the more contradictions start piling up, conveniences upon conveniences, all to make sure that the player's actions never have any drawbacks whatsoever. Even much of the world's design falls into a similar trap. Fast travel was a given, considering how large the world is, but the density of sites of grace make that world feel more like an amusement park than a dying and desolate place. Caelid is visually quite intimidating, but having three sites of grace within 30 seconds of each other really undermines what should be a crushingly hostile area. Even its poison swamps can be utterly negated by just summoning Torrent, yet another strike against him. When replaying the game, I noticed something that was introduced in a patch after beating Radahn. Seeing the meteor fall in the cutscene and then going out to find where it landed resulted in quite the memorable discovery. Anyone playing on current versions of the game doesn't get to do this because now a red dot just gets put on the map to make sure you don't waste any time exploring in this open world game with a focus on exploration. Other too convenient features like respecs and resetting NPC hostility have the same negative effects and shouldn't be given a pass just because they were in previous games as well. Even the tutorial system is changed to show immersion-breaking pop-ups which require menu use to disable, abandoning the elegant solution of using the in-game message system. Don't even get me started on the pop-up messages that appear every single time you open a catacomb door. On my first playthrough, when Kenneth Haight asked me to enter his service, I declined. This sounded like a choice with permanent repercussions, and it would be unwise to join without a better understanding of the situation. So I waited until I found Ronnie, who asked a similar question. I also declined her, and went on my way. Of course, it turns out that neither of these choices are choices at all. You just say yes to progress the questline. In retrospect, my line of reasoning might seem a bit silly, but it shows that I was ready to be immersed in the game's world and give serious thought to the decisions that I was making. But the game wasn't prepared to accommodate this. This kind of non-choice is especially disappointing to see in Elden Ring because it's a regression from the design of previous From Software games, where the answers the player gives to NPCs often have a huge impact on their actions. Even the one choice that is given a lot of emphasis, whether or not to be embraced by the Three Fingers, is entirely reversible, once again removing any tension that it otherwise may have held. Elden Ring has inarguably achieved resounding success, but I worry that the often hyperbolic praise granted to the game will continue to lead From Software down the path of repeating their own mistakes. Lending a critical eye to what we love most is often a good way of preventing it from stagnating. If Elden Ring were made by any other large studio, this video probably wouldn't exist. It doesn't surprise anyone when the next big budget game is just as generic as the last, but From Software has shown me that they can buck convention to make truly great games, and I hope that will prove true in the future once again.